Ann Bauer-Lazowitz has been with our fellowship for about 2 years. And as Ann comes forward to light our chalice this morning, I invite you to rise in body or spirit to speak aloud our affirmation. If you are on Zoom, please keep muted as you speak, and the words are printed in the chat line. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes, do we unite in worship.
Since Shakespeare seems to be in the air these days, I'd like to start with a couple of words by him on the subject of love. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no. It is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken.
Great. Thank you, Ann.
The reading by James Baldwin, I'll summarize for you. He calls us to be brave with love and to live a love that is tough and resilient and strong. James Baldwin has inspired parts of this sermon. I want to start, though, by telling you about an event in my grandson Danny's preschool class. Shortly after the 2020 election, his class chose Kamala Harris as the class superhero. Through preschoolers' lenses, Dan and his classmates learned that Harris is someone to admire for her many accomplishments in politics, in race, in gender. A few weeks after Harris's ascension to superhero status, a text from my daughter included a picture of Dan himself proudly waving a superhero sign. That day, he won the class superhero award. He, too, was a superhero. His royal duties included wearing an elegant cape that day and enjoying others focused on his heroic worth and dignity. I assure you that during those weeks of honoring Kamala Harris, his teachers guaranteed that each child in his classroom, which, by the way, includes children from about a dozen countries, each child in turn had a turn at superhero fame. As they held up Kamala Harris as a model, they took on the qualities she embodied. That project in Dan's class reminded me of advice from 19th century Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson wrote this: "A person will worship something. Have no doubt about that. That which dominates our imagination and our thoughts will determine our lives and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship. For what we worship, we are becoming." Recalling January's worship theme of finding our center, I want to amend Emerson's worship language a bit to say something like this: what we place at our center, or what we recognize as important, we are becoming. The invitation to Dan and his classmates to focus on Kamala Harris as someone who has broken many boundaries awakened them to possibilities for also becoming boundary breakers, even perhaps before they reached adulthood. So here at the start of the new month, let's connect January's worship theme with February's theme of love. Love is an appropriate theme at this time of year when thoughts turn to Valentine's and other ways of showing appreciation to one another. Today, let's reflect on what it means to put love at our center. Specifically, through the current UU project, which, if it follows Emerson's advice, suggests that the more Unitarian Universalists center love, the more we become love. Now, Harrison has already introduced this concept to you. I'm grateful for his explanation, as well as for all the children. They were really engaged in this project last Sunday when he brought this idea to them. So it's just so wonderful to see them so jazzed about the words that we use, the words that we value. I've created a diagram, which Harrison has already pointed you to, so I invite you to notice that handout, which has some information about what I'm talking about this morning. Harrison referred to this current project that we're engaged in as Article 2. Unitarian Universalists around the country are learning and evaluating a proposal to update the language in Article 2. That section of the national bylaws of this denomination, which includes the principles and the purposes of Unitarian Universalism. This proposed project puts love at the center of the core values. Love is the core value. I invite you, as one of many congregations which every Sunday affirms love as the doctrine of this church, to hear more about this project. After all, who can turn down having more love in this world? And Joe, thank you for the diagram that's also on the screen. Thank you. So before explaining what Article 2 is about, let's be reminded that Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal, not a creedal faith. We are joined together not by common beliefs, instead by common values, which define our actions with one another. Last fall, I reflected on covenant. That is, it's covenant which defines how we are together, in a sermon that I called Deeds, Not Creeds, to explain the importance of our promises and agreements for our actions with one another, not our common beliefs. This is a religion grounded in common practices for our actions, not requiring common beliefs. Our covenant at the broadest national level of Unitarian Universalism is articulated in the 7 principles, a document known very well by many of you, I know, and clearly known by the children, especially in the children's version. The 7 principles may be the most commonly quoted words about Unitarian Universalism. You can review them on the front side of the handout. These 7 principles appear in Article 2 of the national bylaws, which for some of you may seem a bit quirky or maybe ironic, that the major statement of UU's relational qualities, that is the covenant, is located in the primary governance document. This is how the bylaws were set up in 1961. I wasn't there when this denomination was founded through the merger of Unitarians and Universalists. So I don't know exactly how this covenant ended up in the bylaws, but it's there. The bylaws themselves state that periodically some sections should be reviewed and possibly revised. Subject to regular review is Article 2, and specifically the 7 principles. Updating the language of the 7 principles is intended to better reflect current UU values and promises. The current version of the 7 principles has been around for almost 30 years. That's the one on your handout right now. It was adopted in 1985. That version was supposed to be updated 15 years ago, but proposals to update it didn't pass. So we've been using the current principles for the last 30 years. When that version was passed in 1985, it represented significant changes from the wording we had been using since 1961 when this denomination was founded. The 1985 version, that is the version we're using now, was influenced especially by the UU Women's Federation, when we were in a period of cleaning up and advancing gender equity in UU documents. Around 1985 was when we cleaned up the sexist language in the hymnal as well. So by now, in the early 21st century, the 1985 wording of the principles is in serious need of updating. Just as in 1985, women's rights was a big influence on that new wording, here in 2023, we are again called to update our core values. To quote our national president, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the racist and misogynistic campaign of Donald Trump, and urgent calls to confront white supremacy in our own UU movement compel us to ask if the 1985 principles fully reflect who and what Unitarian Universalism stands for today, unquote from the president. Over the past decade, we've had several initiatives to update our language. Some of you may have heard about the 8th Principle Project, which has been going on for about 5 or 6 years, which advances a commitment to dismantle racism. The 8th Principle has been adopted by hundreds of congregations around the country at the local level. But now there has been a call to update the principles at the national level, and a commission called the Commission for Article 2 has collected a lot of opinions and input from people around the country. They recently submitted recommendations to the National Board, with most significantly rewording of the 7 principles. The new statement of UU values appears on the diagram on the handout and on the screen that Joe has posted on the wall. To me, this diagram is appropriately descriptive and colorful. It places love at the center. Finally, yes, friends, finally we're getting back to love, in case you were wondering what happened to it through all this bylaws talk. Love is at the center of our new proposed covenant. When the Article 2 Commission was formed, the group was encouraged to include love from many sides. I've been a UU since 1990. I love this faith. I celebrated the 7 principles when I first learned about them. They articulated values which I had been living my whole life, but I'd never had so clearly defined. However, just as Harrison pointed out with the children, I had always wondered, if these principles are a core statement about a religious movement, why does the word love not appear in them? For so many religions in the world, love is important, if not central. It's high time for UUs to focus on love, along with the other 6 values identified as important accompaniments to love on the diagram. That is, interdependence, justice, pluralism, transformation, generosity, and equity. I'm also touched and moved by this new logo, which the children were also moved by last week when they worked to create their own version of it. For me, this logo is dynamic and artistic, and it connects all the values to their neighbors on the color scheme. More importantly, the centering power of love brings all the values together. There's no beginning or end. Like right now, we have 7 principles that start with number 1 and end with number 7, but 7 never connects back to 1. This new image, to me, is a very dynamic connection of all our values. Now, clearly, in one brief sermon, I can't say all that might be said about this new proposal. A proposal for a new version of articulating UU principles. But let's consider a few aspects of the proposal. For one, we might want to better discern, what does love actually mean? What does love actually look like, especially in a UU context? Some have argued that because love is a word with so many nuances and interpretations, there's really no center of substance to this diagram. That may have been your response to it or your reaction. In contrast, In some religious traditions, love is said to be powerful enough to cast out fear. Love is the energy which makes life flourishing. Our Universalist ancestors said love is God, and God is love. So it's clear to me that the type of love imagined in this diagram, in this new values statement, is the kind of love that James Baldwin asserted in that reading that I referred to, when he said, love is a statement of grace. Not love in the sense of being made happy, but love in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring. That's the sense of love in this diagram. Love that is tough and universal. So I invite you to a brief reflection yourself. How do you personally define love? How do you know when it's present? When you're giving it, or when you're receiving it? And not only by relying on Hallmark, who can help you care enough to send your very best, as the ads say. If you authentically place love at your center of any activity or any relationship, does that centrality change the sense of how you function in the world? Think on any justice project or family activity or any event in this congregation which embodies love. Think about individuals who might serve as contemporary models of love for you. Mother Teresa, or Martin Luther King, or Gandhi, or the Dalai Lama, for example. Perhaps another way to interpret this new figure is that while love lies at the center, it takes the workings of the other 6 values which surround love to demonstrate love in action, love in the world. Love becomes manifest when we practice the other 6 values: interdependence, equity, transformation, etc. All these values are part of and contribute to expanding our human capacity for love. Echoing Emerson's message, what we center, what we become. Centering love, we generate love in the world. For example, when we take a stand for any particular justice initiative, such as Black Lives Matter, are we not also declaring our love for Black lives? Or, this being the UUFD stewardship period, when we give with openness and generosity, is our stewardship not an expression of love for this congregation and for the values it stands for? Think how we demonstrate love to one another if we remain open and flexible to all these new ideas, new ways of developing relationships. So I'm curious, if this is the first time you've heard about changes to the UU7 principles, what are your reactions? I have heard some question why we need to change something as beloved as the principles. I think some historical perspective helps. If we consider liberal faith as a living tradition, the title of our gray hymnal, by the way, a living tradition is always open to change. For folks who became Unitarian Universalists prior to 1985, and I wonder, was anybody a UU before 1985 in this room? A few of you. Lovely, lovely. Before 1985, you actually knew a different version of the principles, one that had been created in 1961. And in 1961, new principles were created when the 2 denominations merged. So the notion of revising the principles and going on to new wording is historical. It's not out of keeping with what this living tradition is. And to be clear, if Article 2 passes at General Assembly in 2023 and 2024, it doesn't mean the 7 principles go away. We don't need to throw away all those posters and stationery and T-shirts that have the 7 principles planted on them. We will keep the 7 principles and complement how we articulate our values with this new image. So one final pitch, and I'll be brief. The topic of Article 2 will be central to General Assembly 2023, which will be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in June. I encourage everyone to consider attending General Assembly, either in person or online. Online, it's $150 cheaper than if you go in person. And there's special discounts for first-timers to General Assembly. And I understand the board is offering some financial support as well from here, if you wish to attend. I also invite you to consider serving as a delegate to General Assembly, so you can represent the perspective of this congregation when we vote on Article 2. And by the way, also this year we elect a new president of this denomination, and it will most likely be the first Black woman in our presidency. Yay for Sophia Bettencourt. Yes, yes. So I encourage you to keep your eye open for more news about General Assembly. And in reflection time after the service, we'll continue to talk about this. I invite you to come back roughly 11:30 to 12, and we'll continue to talk about this topic. Our current UUA president, Reverend Susan, invites Unitarian Universalists to approach the conversation about Article 2 with openness and curiosity, listening with whole hearts to different opinions, all the while holding love at the center. My friends, may love shape our personal actions and relationships, our community as a congregation of liberal faith, and our connections with all of life. May all this be so.